How's it going, everyone? All right. Welcome to the afternoon of the climate program, mid-afternoon. As you can see, the New Haven Chamber of Commerce changed the weather so that we have a perfect day out there. Goldilocks weather, great backdrop for this panel. Here we have the kind of really interesting one. So the bridges and accelerators of clean economy, capital, community, and cooperation. And I just want to highlight the people on this stage. You know, they're going to introduce themselves, but I want to give you something that you may not know about many of them here and the kind of ways that they cooperate or do the little things or support people or teach or engage. That's kind of in the midst of having incredibly busy lives and portfolios, how do you do other things that help the community? And so right now, Dawn is actually helping us build a case study at the School of Management on the experience at Elemental Accelerator. Like, where do you figure out how to teach all the next generation of people who need to make these investments? Nancy taught a class on impact investing when there was no class taught here, and she was asked to do it, and her daughter was at Brown, I believe, and she was flying in on a consistent basis while running DBL to then figure out how to teach a class. Jockey helped launch, start, and build a publication at Yale called the Clean Energy Finance Forum with us at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, where he was exploring many of the same issues that you see in his work now as a student while he was getting 2 degrees here, and we were paying him some absurdly small rate, and he was just doing it because of intrinsic motivation. All right, and then our moderator, Richard Kaufman, who I'll embarrass a little bit more, has been teaching a class on financing green technologies at the School of Management for 15 years. 15 years in between being the energy czar of New York, working at the Department of Energy in a range of ways, like being the chairman of a range of different organizations and companies, and always making the time to kind of show up, mentor, support, and engage in a way that you never get thanked for as a lecturer when you're doing that on a consistent basis. And thank you, because you've been a node and a support for this community for over, a decade and a half, and you made an incredible difference. I mean, if somebody could raise their hand, who, thank you. Like, right, like you can already, there's multiple people in the room who you've made a profound difference in their lives, and we just deeply appreciate your time. Thank you.
Stuart, thanks. Do we need this?
Yeah, yes.
Does this work? Hello. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you. You know, we found out that we're competing against the psychedelic. So we'll be passing out mushrooms at the end of the... So people did have a chance to see everybody's background. Is that right? Or do we need to introduce ourselves anymore? In that case, then, unless there's one thing you want to say, Dawn, about yourself that isn't... No.
Aloha. Nice to see everyone.
Nancy, anything you want to say about yourself that... Yeah? Jahi? Okay, great. All right. So we want to talk about a few things on this panel. I think we want to talk about innovation, communities, and money. And so let's start with money, because without money, we're not going to be able to fund innovation. And I think all of us, in one way or another, are involved in giving out money. So when we talk about money and innovation, I think that we often think about the large quantities of money that are required. And while AI is really important and software is really important, the amount of capital that we're going to need isn't going to come from, or the solutions we're going to need are going to require trillions of dollars of capital. So it's the capital intensive innovations where we have a challenge in financing. And so people always talk about the valley of death, and that's this period of time and money that's required to get a company from one stage to eventual financial self-sufficiency. And so maybe one of the reasons why there's been a problem with the financing the valley of death is really what we might call the financing infrastructure, the financing ecosystem, which was really built for financing other things in the economy. And so we've been trying to shoehorn the financing of capital-intensive climate solutions into these other investing silos. So project financing, for example, wasn't designed for things that are innovative technology, and they weren't designed for small projects. And we've been trying to go to bank markets when banks really, for a variety of reasons, have difficulty lending to things that have long maturities. We have, in contrast to other things in the economy, we have very limited use of stock and bond markets. And some people would even say that the venture capital business model is really inconsistent with things that take a lot of capital and take a long time to get to market. So I want to start with Don and Nancy that have both been involved in financing early stage companies and get their perspective now on where they see the financing ecosystem and where it is and where you think it's going.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Stu. And thanks to the Yale community for, this is just such an inspiring gathering, and to see this amount of interest in this all important work. It's great to be back on campus. Certainly when the history is written about climate investing, 1.0, 2.0, whatever 3.0 becomes, it's going to be gripping because there are so many near-death experiences on the way to where we're all going to land that it's dizzying. And having lived through that when we started DBL back in the early 2000s, today you take a breath and you say, wow, there's an infrastructure now, there's many more funds, there's public support, a lot of things that are going right that we always dreamed about in those early days. And yet for me, getting policy right, getting innovation and sources of capital together, that's really where the win is. That's where you build, multi-billion-dollar companies from scratch. And the problem I see is that we just don't have enough of them yet. We don't have the kinds of companies that we take for granted in software or now AI. It's still early days, and part of that is what Richard referenced, is that these are complicated businesses. They take a long time to get the technology right. It's expensive. I mean, building a car company, people would laugh at you when you said you were a venture capitalist investing in an electric car company back in 2006. And they were right. I mean, it could have gone, it almost went under many times. And yet you need those pivotal moments, those entrepreneurs that won't accept no for an answer and piece together a financing strategy, be it with VCs, with corporate investors, with government programs and regulations that favor new entrants. The difference today, which is so refreshing, is that it was all bespoke back in the early days, and you take a zero emission vehicle credit when you could, or you take a Million Solar Roofs program from the state of California, and you stitch together a glide path that allowed you to get to those huge amounts of capital that you needed to become an international player. Today, those tools are all available to us in much higher quantities. And so it's on us to put that together, have that awareness that policy, that inclusion, that climate are all of a same piece, and then find the entrepreneurs. And obviously, from a venture perspective, that really is the most important, is not to be seduced by entrepreneurs that are not in it for the right reasons or don't have the talent, need help going forward, and really get yourself plugged into the entrepreneurs that won't quit, that have the grit, and that understand that it's not a software company, that you need to develop stakeholder value and in a way of working that includes everyone. And those are the companies that have been successful and that are now the icons, are becoming the icons. We can talk later. Nextracker, one of the most successful IPOs of this period, is a solar tracker company. And it's better than all the other IPOs out there. And it has these recipes of inclusion, policy, financing in ways that are appropriate for its stage and leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Great entrepreneur. That's the key, right? So I think that, Nancy's exactly right. And what's interesting of the last period, as we sort of look back on where venture capital has come, there was definitely a time, I think really about 10 years ago, when there was just not enough venture capital and risk capital kind of coming into our space and climate. And that is totally different now. So, I mean, last year was around $70 billion of venture capital. So we're now seeing early stage venture fund, a lot more venture funds, a lot more venture capital activity. We're also seeing a very different level of entrepreneur. So I started Elemental about 15 years ago. I've invested in about 160 companies in this space. And 15 years ago, we just were not seeing the kind of entrepreneurial talent we see now. And some of this has happened in like specific moments, like when the skies turned orange over San Francisco in 2018, we just saw a lot of talent from tech just saying, actually, I'm kind of done being at Meta or Google, and I really want to come into climate, and what can I do? And we're still continuing to see that sort of movement of talent from many different industries into climate. So what I see now is that we have extraordinary and really unprecedented entrepreneurial talent coming into climate, starting companies. Last year, about 1,000 climate companies are started. So a lot of company formation and some very strong entrepreneurial talent there. And then and a more mature early stage capital ecosystem and very good venture investors in this space. What we then are seeing, though, is as these companies are growing, there's a really significant valley of capital, especially for hardware companies. I think especially for longer term capital that can help companies grow. And so right now there's only about 600 like mature climate companies that are delivering at scale. And we need many more than this. In fact, McKinsey estimates that 45% of the technologies we need to get to our net zero goals are not yet available at scale. They're not yet available commercially. So we have an enormous amount of work to do between all of this invention and really good early stage stuff that's happening and moving that towards scale in a logical way with capital that aligns with the kinds of risk that we're seeing at these various stages. At Elemental, we think there's three key things to kind of building this bridge from early stage to later stage. We think it's catalytic capital. We think it's project expertise and real hardware expertise. And we think it's community and community engagement. And I can give some examples of how we've seen those three move the needle later on. But those are the three ingredients that we've seen and the data show actually can help move from early stage to available at scale. And there's going to be a mix of public, philanthropic, and risk capital, investment capital that helps make that transition. But the good news is that on the other side of this, it's a very painful bridge. We're seeing a lot of companies not being able to cross it right now. This is especially in this last year. But what the good news is on the other side of the bridge, there's more than $120 billion of private capital that is ready to invest in climate, that's sort of ready to invest in bankable projects. So that also feels new, that we have a quite mature early stage ecosystem. We have a lot of capital now ready to invest in commercial technologies and bankable projects, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund from the Inflation Reduction Act, and a lot of private capital. And it's really, I think, about building a thoughtful and effective bridge.
So I just want to follow up on this question of where the missing money is, because you've talked about philanthropic capital. But Jahi, I want to have you come in and talk about how you see the role of government money in this painful bridge. I love that idea, bridge of size.
So Jahi Wise, I am a senior advisor to the administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency, and just previous to this role, ran the Office of Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a $27 billion fund that was created in the Inflation Reduction Act to deploy clean technologies throughout our economy. I think, John Podesta actually says this, I think best. He says he sees this transition as government enabled, but private sector led. And so our role is to help write the rules of the road, provide the appropriate sets of market incentives to move the massive amounts of capital off the sidelines into these technologies. And the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, they represent kind of an architecture programs that help kind of direct capital to where we think it needs to go. Specifically, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is this really interesting tool that was created to address the need for institutional financing in the clean technology deployment space. We now have a tax code that provides 10 years of certainty for clean energy tax credits, which is incredible. But we still need these institutions that can strategically deploy capital into transactions, into market segments that aren't seeing the deployment of technologies, and specifically technologies that we know are already commercialized. So going back to this question of innovation, we're actually looking not at technology innovation. These aren't things that need to get over the technology risk. These are things that are already out in the market working, but we need them to work in places where they aren't currently being deployed. Low-income communities, certain community scale deployments, et cetera. The GGRF, kind of to give a little bit of a structure for it, is basically 3 different programs. There's a national clean investment fund program, which is $14 billion. That's been provided to 3 national, call them loan funds, that will go out and provide scale capital to clean technology projects across the country over the next 7 years. $6 billion of it has been allocated to 5 nonprofit kind of hubs that will downstream that capital in the form of capitalization awards into hundreds of community lenders across the country to enable more origination and a deeper penetration of climate finance into communities that haven't typically had access to that. And the last is Solar for All competition, which provides $7 billion to really foment the deployment of low-income solar across the country. So, we see this suite of programs as part of this larger architecture of programs that are designed to send the right signals. And we see that as our role, is to send the signals, provide the risk capital that enables these folks to come in behind and move more deeply into these markets and mobilize the trillions of dollars. $27 billion is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money when you actually look at the scale of the problem.
Do you want to talk about philanthropic?
Yeah, maybe we'll just double click on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund real quickly, though, is for folks that might not be as familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is about 1/6 of the non-tax dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's a huge piece of it. And what's so special, Elemental is a nonprofit investor. So we invest in companies and recycle the returns back to the nonprofit. We also have a venture fund, a sister venture fund called Earthshot Ventures that operates like a typical venture fund. And what's so interesting about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is that from an investor perspective, it's much easier to co-invest with financial products than with necessarily like a DOE grant or like a tax credit, right? So these are really helpful. We love DOE grants and all, grant programs and tax credits. Those are very helpful for moving things forward. But the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is very special because they're dollars that don't just go out one time and they're gone. They're designed to be recycled and continue moving in the ecosystem, continue providing greenhouse gas reductions and community benefits for many years to come. So they're financing products, which means that banks and philanthropy and investors like us can co-invest with them in a very different and sort of much more seamless, lower friction way than with other kinds of dollars that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's a grand experiment. It's the first time the U.S. is doing something like this, and it's extremely exciting and groundbreaking to see something like this in the IRA. So, those of us who are sort of involved in this, I would say, are leaning in really hard to try and make sure this is successful and we get another chance to do something like this. But I was just the last piece you asked about philanthropy. There's a lot of ways that philanthropy needs to plug in. One of the key ways that we see philanthropy plugging in is to help move projects through catalytic capital, sort of into readiness for both GGRF and other bankable sort of like commercial finance. And so providing catalytic capital to move like first of a kind or early of a kind projects that have some technology risk in them, projects that have some commercial or offtake risk that other financiers don't necessarily want to take, are the ways that philanthropy can provide some first loss capital, can kind of wrap projects in an interesting way, or provide other kinds of catalytic products to move this forward. So that's one of the things that Elemental is really focused on.
So I was just going to add one other thing in terms of missing money and the way the ecosystem is changing is that when we look at the biotech sector if you're a inventor and you develop a molecule and you want to take the business all the way through to scale, it takes a long time, and it actually takes a lot of dough to do that, which is not all that different in terms of the amount of time and money it takes to do something in the clean tech world. So for the most part, the biotech sector hasn't really experienced a valley of death from a capital formation standpoint. So, so what's different? Well, what's different? Oh, Nancy, you're going to jump in because I know you're a healthcare person.
I was a biotech investor.
Okay, so go ahead.
Well, it's really different because, obviously the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable over decade industries on our planet. They outsourced a long time ago much of their R&D, favoring VCs funding Genentech in 1978 or whenever that was, and then buying them later. Because there was no cannibalism of their existing business by investing in a Genentech. They got their next generation of FDA-approved drugs. That's not the case. I mean, Exxon, there's just a fundamental, there's a disconnect between what a lot of the incumbents survive on in energy and transportation and in ag, and what the transition will look like, and it's not as profitable.
Okay, so just to keep going on this, I think that what's funded the biotech sector in terms of scale up post VC have been growth investors. And growth investors typically are willing to take either technology risk or market risk. So in the case of biotech, certainly those investors were taking technology risk, but they weren't taking a market risk, because if a drug cured cancer, obviously there'd be lots of market demand. But I think, as Nancy points out, in the clean tech space, those investors were being asked to take both risks, both the technology risk and the market risk. And Nancy talked about the role of incumbents really helping to prevent the success of some of the companies. But I do think that things have begun to change for a variety of reasons in terms of government policy. The federal level, Jai talked about, government intent, signaling the market at the state level and certainly at the corporate level. So we are seeing the rise of growth investors. So I guess just to maybe end on this portion of the conversation, can we say that the financing ecosystem is changing? And so how optimistic are you about where we are?
Well,
in the financing.
Well, let me give you a very concrete example. I'm super optimistic because the Next Tracker, which if you look it up, it's one of the most successful IPOs. It's a solar tracking company. It's billions of dollars of valuation. And it has no trouble raising money now. We'll likely do a secondary after and it's doubled since its IPO about 18 months ago. So and the envy of everybody. We invested in Next Tracker, I think, in its predecessor in 2005, and the return we got, there was no growth investor. It was capital intensive. We didn't have the funds, the syndicate to fund a big hardware company, which is what the company was at the time, although now it's more software. And so we sold the company to our contract manufacturer, Flextronics. That they wanted to get into solar. They were hearing good things about solar. It was an odd acquisition. It was a fantastic investment. I think we well over 10x in like 18 months. So absolutely fantastic investment, and it built the base for making one of the ways to make solar more cost effective by tracking the panels better and getting more output. So fast forward to a few years ago, what was not available to us at the time became available. The entrepreneur wanted to take the company public. So he worked with TPG Rise, which is one of the growth investors in impact that didn't exist when we were trying to find late stage investors for Nextracker back in 2007. And they said, we'll help you spin this company out and we'll invest so that you can become a public company. And so they invested at a $3 billion valuation, put in several hundred million. And lo and behold, the company went public. Not at much of a uptick, but now it's doubled in price. And so this story just shows you that today the options for Dan Sugar, the entrepreneur in question, are so much better than not that we didn't make a great return back then, but we weren't able to scale the business as a standalone, and because it took much more capital. And now there are these late stage impact and sustainability oriented investors. So I think it's just a much brighter picture for not just the entrepreneur in question, but to the employees. Now we're hiring many more people and putting these systems all over the globe.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also from the public sector perspective, over the last few years, we've seen a rise in the federal government in some ways as a growth investor. Like, we have committed through much of our policies to take the market, specifically the market risk portion. So you look at the tax code, for projects that are, paying prevailing wage in low income and disadvantaged communities, in communities that used to depend on fossil fuels, you can have up to 60% of the project costs covered through a tax credit. That fundamentally changes the economics for projects. And GGRF as risk capital, some of the other programs, just as straight grants, do the same thing. So I think we've seen the emergence as well of the federal government as a true supporter enabler of growth in these spaces, because we recognize the need to scale as quickly as possible to meet the moment on climate change and the opportunity and the risk of not mitigating its impacts.
Of course I'm optimistic, Richard. Trick question. But I think in particular because we're seeing sort of the quality of entrepreneurs come through. A couple here. We have Marshall and Steph in the Elemental portfolio. Really amazing entrepreneurs. And these are entrepreneurs who, could be building a business in any sector, and they are building a business in climate, because this is the most important problem to solve in this particular window, or this is what we believe who are working on this and entrepreneurs working on this. And so they're committed to doing this, even though it's hard. And there's a lot more roadblocks in building a typical tech company. But it's a huge market. It's a growing market. It's not one market. And it's not just energy. It's absolutely everything. It's industrials. It's agriculture. It's food. It's water. It's across everything. So I feel very optimistic about that. I also feel very optimistic because in the last couple of years, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are new players working with each other and thinking creatively in this space that we have never seen in the 15 years I've been in this space. So just one example is that a couple of months ago, we launched something called a Resilient Housing Challenge with Finance New Orleans to bring new technologies to housing in New Orleans, which really is thinking deeply about how to create affordable, resilient housing, which is something that we need actually really across this country if you're sort of following the news and what's going on. And they had really wanted to do something to bring innovators and bring entrepreneurs there. There hadn't really been a window to do that. We started working with them a few months ago and collaborated to do this. And it's a lot of this kind of activity, this and many others like it, is catalyzed by the Inflation Reduction Act, by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, by the fact that we're capitalizing community lenders, community banks, CDFIs, green banks that have not had capital to do this work at scale. So even just the fact that those dollars are coming, people are thinking in really creative ways and working with people they've never worked with, from venture investors working across public financing institutions, working across banks, working across different kinds of debt providers, thinking very creatively about how to do this. At Elemental, we're creating new products to do this. So we just created something that's essentially like a synthetic development loan, which is a product that, real estate investors have had this, all kinds of other businesses and industries have this. In climate, we haven't really been able to have capital like that, development loans, right? So we're instead funding development on venture dollars. It doesn't really make sense. There's way better ways to do this. So we created a synthetic one. So we're thinking differently. And I think a lot of this activity has been inspired by and will ultimately be scaled up by the vision of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that is a fundamentally different environment than we were living in 2 years ago.
Can I just give one more example of that connectivity between the different funding sources? That it's not a nice to have; it's really the secret sauce of this field in terms of how you get to positive outcomes. Just as an example, there are laws now in the EU that are going into effect that will make it illegal to import soybeans and other grains eventually that have been shown to contribute to deforestation. And so this could wreak havoc on imports and exports, and yet it's driven by a climate imperative. It's wonderful on that level. So tracing back to the EPA and startups and incumbents, the way that we're going to win on that is by connecting these communities that never were connected before. So farmers who grow the soybeans, the corn, the grains, are finally, because of laws like these and the EPA's program that is allowing farmers to get paid more if they grow regenerative crops, meet a startup called FBN, which is actually a big company now, Farmers Business Network, that's been tracking all the carbon production and deforestation related to agriculture, meet the largest grain buyer in the world, which is Archer Daniels Midland, ADM. This is the strangest bedfellows that now they're all coming together, and ADM is able to say through its data set, no, this farm did not contribute to deforestation. FBN is able to say it has a much lower carbon footprint, and then ADM says, okay, we're going to pay that farmer more, and the EPA program helps out. And all of a sudden, finally, farmers have a reason to develop crops that create less carbon and don't contribute to deforestation because they're getting paid. And we're able to satisfy the needs of Europe in terms of the criteria. And that is the magic. I mean, that doesn't happen. I mean, trust me, I've invested in biotech, I've invested in software. Those are fabulous industries to be in. But that kind of interconnectivity and that ability to bring together people that never used to talk to each other. And the enviros are in it too, because they want to verify the regenerative claims. And these constituencies never worked together before. And now they're transforming agriculture so that our children and grandchildren are going to be able to participate in an economy where agriculture is not always the villain and is expected to feed a growing planet at the same time.
So Jahi, Don and Nancy have talked about communities and given examples of communities. You want to, and obviously you've mentioned the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has a community-based focus. You want to talk more about a community story that you think has been important to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'll just give a little bit more on the architecture and how the administration has kind of built out. So we came in with a mandate to put communities at the center of climate. One, because it's the right thing to do. Two, because it's the way to actually accelerate deployment. We need communities to be supportive of and active participants in the deployment of these technologies to have any chance of hitting our adoption goals. One of the key mechanisms that we put in place to facilitate community investment in climate is the Justice 40 program. And so this is a commitment that was made in our kind of day one executive order that 40% of the benefits of clean energy and climate investment would go to low income and disadvantaged communities. Huge. I mean, massive. And then folks like me spent 2 years talking to every program in the federal government to figure out, okay, exactly how do you do that? And what does that look like? And the effects of that are now being felt in programs like EPA and USDA's Regenerative Agriculture Program, in other aspects of work across the agency. What really animates that commitment, though, is this construct of low-income and disadvantaged communities, and I think it's something folks should really think about. Essentially, the White House has published a map. It's called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, and it identifies a number of census tracts. And those census tracts are communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change, by exposure to environmental hazards, low income, educational attainment, a kind of host of things that make a community low income and disadvantaged. And then we've wired into programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, into the tax code, a special nudge towards investment in those communities. And so that's where we're seeing a huge uptick in investment, and it's coming through this kind of broader push to make sure that communities are centered. I think there's a lot of places where folks are doing really interesting things right now. I'll go with an example I was talking about before we started this conversation. Went to Pittsburgh for the Energy Ministerial a year or so ago, and went up to see, and I'm forgetting the name now, so I'll have to remember the actual name of the company, but went up to see a company that's producing utility scale batteries in this disadvantaged community, kind of up the hill in Pittsburgh, and they're using plastic and electrolytes as kind of the core inputs. And what's really compelling about it is they've been able to draw their entire labor force from unemployed workers in the Pittsburgh community. And so you see this really virtuous cycle where they're getting, offtake contracts from major utilities across the country for their big, container size battery equipment. And those are being built by folks in that community who see a future, a career, good paying jobs, family sustaining jobs from that deployment. And we also have tax credits that support those types of projects as well. So I think, a lot of folks across the country, and we'll continue to see folks receiving these benefits both in the form of lower energy bills because they have access to lower cost solar, and new jobs in manufacturing, in cleaner air. I think that the community benefits will be massive, but it's an intentional part of the way that we need to approach climate. And one of the things I'm most excited about is that's kind of permeated every aspect of the financing ecosystem and the technology deployment ecosystem at this point.
So that's great. I maybe add one other story about communities that says something about state policy innovation, if I could, for a second. So community solar in New York State. So there's been a real evolution, I think, in the last 10 years about state policy because states realize that there's an economic development opportunity. And the other thing is that the cost of electricity is to continue to go up. Maybe natural gas prices are low, but the cost of actually getting electricity to customers has continued to increase while the cost of distributed solutions have been going down. And so that creates real issues of equity and affordability because those customers that can afford a distributed solution can go that way, leaving the cost of the rest of the system to be borne by others. The other issue is that the way that states have funded clean energy programs is through charges on customer bills, and that's effectively a regressive tax. And giving out grants in the traditional way hasn't really achieved very much scale. So New York State, was late to the solar industry, say relative to California. Sorry, Nancy. But in terms of community solar, the benefit of community solar is it's for people that can't have solar on their roofs for one reason or another, and it's also cheaper than rooftop solar, and it can deploy a lot more solar. So it's an example of state policy innovation, but the key element of the innovation was to come up with a way to value the location of where the solar should go, because the critics of solar would say, well, when you put solar on the system, it just costs other customers. And of course, the advocates of solar say, well, no, solar actually helps the system. But the answer is, sort of the old real estate adage, it's location, location, location. So establishing a value for distributed energy resources was an innovation at the state level that's now meant that New York State is the number one state for community solar. And it means that it's not of benefit just to those customers, and there's a requirement for low-income people to have a percentage participation in every community solar project, but it also helps the grid as a whole. So I just wanted to mention that as another kind of community example. Nancy, you're going to...
And it goes, I mean, solar has had those programs, and to see them blossom that way is just a dream come true. I think what's so, to your point, the fact that government is so savvy now about how to tie climate progress with community engagement at all levels. And just one example that's not from energy, which is, we have a company called Bellwether Coffee, and what many of you don't know is that, unfortunately, your favorite morning beverage is a cup of carbon, not a cup of coffee. I mean, it's very laden. And so there is hope. You don't have to feel guilty. And one of the main carbon sources is the roasting of coffee, because it's done in centralized natural gas fueled belching particulates factories or warehouses that are usually in low income neighborhoods. And so along comes a company that a bunch of us have funded that has an electric, ventless, quiet roaster of coffee that you can put in the cafe or in the cafeteria for your company. And it can reduce up to 87% of the carbon of the roasting process, and reduces packaging and transportation as well. And the coffee tastes better, because freshly roasted coffee, as many of you coffee snobs out there know, is much better than something that's been sitting on the shelf for weeks. So what's not to love about this company? Well, COVID almost killed the company, because no one was out getting coffee for a long time. Anyway, that all turned okay. But so to my point about the government has a program, the California Energy Commission, to decarbonize food production in the state, which is a huge business in the state. And so we say, oh, well, we're doing that. We're going to apply for our grant. And so that the roasters that buy our system will get a subsidy to help launch this new approach. And so what happened is we wrote the grant, and it just so happens that the head of the CEC, David Hochschild, who was one of the founders of Vote Solar back in the early 2000s, has been at Climate as a not-for-profit. As he worked for Dan Sugar for a while. I mean, just a true public servant now, the head of the CEC. He called me up and said, "Yeah, I hear you're applying, but we have a focus on low-income and disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately exposed to particulates. So." Whispered in our ear, you should find some roasteries that fit that criteria. And we're like, oh, okay. Well, so it turned out that many of that was easy to do, because these natural gas belching particulate roasteries are in low income neighborhoods. They're also it's compounded by the fact that there's many of them were in the neighborhoods where the catalytic converters were being chopped out of cars, and so it was just like a nightmare in terms of the air pollution. And so we said, okay, and so we worked with the owners and said, would you like to create more jobs and bring this new technology into your community and get paid for doing that? And so that completely refocused the company. Now we're applying, a second level where they want to develop grid storage capabilities in these cafes. And so it wouldn't have happened without the leadership of the government informing the investment process to become more inclusive.
So,
can I give one more thought on this too? Sure. I think this is a really good example that Nancy has, and I'll give one other example, which is from our Elemental portfolio, which is a company that we funded a number of years ago called Ohm Connect. And it's a company that provides a virtual power plant starting in California, now working more broadly across the country. And it's a I think very related to what you're talking about, Nancy, the role of public policies, but also the business imperative and how helpful it can be to align the business goals. So Ohm Connect works by, instead of turning on a natural gas peaker plant from 5 to 9 p.m., like right when the peak is, everyone's coming home, making dinner and taking a shower and energy spikes. Instead of turning on these power plants, which are really quite dirty, and many of them in low-income neighborhoods, they pay people to reduce energy usage at that time. So instead of paying a power plant operator, you're just paying regular families or schools or others to reduce their usage. And you can do this either manually, or they can also do it by controlling your devices and turning those down. And it turns out that this is really effective. You can avoid turning power plants on by doing this, but Ohm Connect was trying to grow. And so we invested in them through Elemental. And what they found was that they had a lot of customer uptake in areas that were more wealthy. But when they tried to go into other neighborhoods, the people would the number one Google result was is Ohm Connect a scam? Because people are not used to getting paid to turn things off. It feels like you're giving us free money. This has to be fake. And so it wasn't that level of trust. So even though we were working with them to try to bring benefits to low-income communities, where, by the way, there is also higher energy use and super regressive, where people are using more energy, it's a higher percentage of their income. It was really, really hard to get customers or program participants in these areas. And so we work with them, kind of kept hitting this wall, and we sort of stopped and said, okay, what does the company look like? Are we sending San Francisco tech guys into neighborhoods in the Central Valley to explain this is a good idea? And so we took a step back and said, what is it, who makes up the company? What languages do they speak? What neighborhoods they come from? And we totally changed the way that we're recruiting people to work at Ohm Connect, coming from those zip codes, from those languages, and then went out again and started doing this, and the company really took off and has now a few 100,000 people across California, is expanding across the country. And so in this way, there was just such, in many times in our view, so at Elemental, we prioritize frontline communities in every single project we fund. 95% of our companies are working with community partners or in low-income and disadvantaged communities. But what we've seen is that in order to be able to do that work well, it takes a lot of work on the company side often, and a prepared mind and a prepared workforce, and who's in your workforce to be able to do that work well. So we consider these two things totally related. Often it's preparing the company and then working really closely with the company to find community partners that are trusted, and then required from us elementals to pay those community partners for the expertise, just like you'd pay a general contractor or an electrician to pay them for the expertise. And it's this it's the whole life cycle that ultimately is allowing us to effectively deploy in frontline communities. So it's not just sort of one piece and one element. It's actually really thinking about it holistically and learning as we go and getting better at it.
All right, so we want to open this up for questions, but I just have a couple of sort of fill-in-the-blank questions for you, okay? So we're in school, we sort of bring you back nightmares of showing up, for the exam and you haven't taken the class. People have had that dream once or twice in this crowd. So, Jahi, start with you. The Yale network...
It's powerful. Yeah, the Yale network is really powerful. I'll echo to these folks, and a lot of folks in this room have all played key roles in my career. Yale has played a key role in my career, from my professors to folks who publish seminal information on the importance of subsidy for fossil fuels that we then repurposed in thinking about subsidy for clean technology deployment, to investors and companies I've worked for. So this network is really potent, especially in this clean financing space.
All right, Nancy. The advice that I have for this group that cares about innovation and energy is...
The advice I have for jump in.
Okay. And Don, the one thing that I didn't say but wanted to...
Jump in. I think this industry has room for a lot of creativity and new ideas. So I think whatever you're passionate about, there's a way to apply it and advance our collective mission around what we're doing here. One thing I think I've really felt about the Yale community for a long time and has been reinforced is that people are really mission driven to make a difference in whatever it is they care about. And whatever that is, there is a place in climate for you.
Okay, so questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much for amazing examples. I love when it's made real. I feel very conflicted because on the one hand, hearing about a government working for the people is amazing and much needed. So everything related to community and inclusion is so important. But on the other hand, I feel also nervous because there's an element of protectionism that we're talking about. So we're talking very much about the US, but we're not talking about the global south and the impact on the global south of some of these quite protectionist measures we're talking about in terms of farming. So I'm from the UK. Most people here from the US, I think. We've already done our deforestation in significant ways and monetized our resources. And now we're telling the global south that they can't, but we're not compensating them. So I love that we're protecting our communities here, but I'm really, really nervous about what the impacts are. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
This is a great question. And the Global South, we have an investment strategy there. And I have to tell you, it's our most difficult because getting all the pieces of the puzzle to work together is very difficult. And the subsidies for incumbents and the lack of disposable income. I mean, it's hard, but the good news, I always want to sort of paint the future in a more positive way, is that we have a company that develops battery storage and inverters so that if you live in a place like Lagos where the grid is weak and it goes up and down and off and on, and that's why people use generators, diesel generators, which are horrible and for all the reasons you understand. It seamlessly allows you to go back and forth between your solar, your batteries, the grid when it's on, and no one knows the difference. And it has been a struggle to get that to take off, and just over the past few years, and to get investors to come in because it is high risk. We're mission driven, and we send a signal when we invest. People say, "Oh, DBL's doing that, so maybe we'll take a look." And that it took 5 years longer than we had anticipated, but it's actually starting to happen. And I think it's because of what you said, the inequity of demanding that the regions of the world that have not contributed to the mess we're in, not get to develop because of a tax that's being placed on them. And so I think empowering and developing these industries that are led by and hire local workers to skip, it's like skipping the generation of landlines and going straight to cell phones, which many parts of Africa did. We can do that in energy.
I think let's go to that question. Another question?
Yeah. So somewhat of a two-part question. You might have somewhat answered it. In regards to capitalization, do you guys invest in projects that are not, the operations are not domestic? And kind of similar question from a government perspective, is capital available for environmentally based projects that the core operations would not be domestic? It wouldn't be in the U.S. essentially.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It depends. There's the government, at least the federal government is massive. A lot of the programming in the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law are focused on domestic deployment. But again, EPA's administrator may actually be right now on a mission to Africa to talk about clean technology deployment there. And so there are tools, and happy to connect you with those resources for how we deploy. To the prior question, I also think there's there's the global south. There's also our domestic global south, or the south. Some of what we've innovated in terms of centering low income and disadvantaged communities here, I think sets the precursors necessary for the broader conversation. Communities here have historically borne the brunt of our extractive fossil fuel economy. There's a reason why certain places are the ones that are overexposed to air pollution or to hazardous waste or higher energy prices. Resolving that is giving us, I think, the conceptual framework and the learnings that then can also be applied in other places. So it's an excellent.
I'll just say quickly too, Elemental does invest across the U.S. and globally. About 20% of our companies come from outside the U.S., about 80% from inside the U.S. And what I would say though too is that there's this recognition of capital gaps and movement for capital is not just in the U.S., it is more broadly. A lot of the work that has been has gone into the IRA, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and these pieces we're now seeing things pop up in other places around the world to emulate that, and to sort of draw technologies forward, projects forward, specifically in Europe, but we're also collaborating very closely with an effort to do this in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in other markets as well. So I think there's definitely an element at which some of these technologies and markets and models that we're creating in the U.S. have a lot of ripple effects we don't even know. And one final thought is that Rhodium Group recently published a paper that said that for every ton of GHG reduction in the U.S. created by the Inflation Reduction Act, they expect to see 3 tons beyond the U.S. And that's because so much of the technology being developed in the U.S. is diffused more broadly, is brought to other places through other business models and other mechanisms. And we are such an engine for technology deployment. So I think we can all also realize that no matter where we're working on this, these things do not stop at our borders. I mean, we are absolutely sort of taking some of the risk and providing some of the risk capital and providing some of the expertise to commercialize things that will benefit people far beyond our shores.
So going back to the comment earlier on the power of the Yale network, for earlier stage climate tech startups or climate focused startups, what would the panel recommend be a good first step for getting involved, getting plugged into all of the great work being done within the Yale community?
Well, I mean, taking Richard's class, Impact Investing by Sue Carter is a fabulous class. I mean, take advantage of all the resources around here, but then understand that people like Dawn and myself, I mean, 2/3 of our investment team comes from SOM at DBL, and most people know someone that knows someone that knows someone that's on our team, and we're not unique. I think the mission of Yale and of SOM is very aligned with DBL and others out there that are leading the charge for changing the world and driving superior returns at the same time.
Dawn, you touched briefly on catalytic capital and de-risking mechanisms. And I would love to hear from all of the panel what kind of successful mechanisms you've seen both to catalyze private capital into the global south or into this valley of financing death beyond the typical first loss tranches and the stuff that we've seen for a long time. I believe Altera committed a couple billions of their $30 billion fund in this sort of first in, last out mechanism, but haven't seen much else that's been innovative. So would be curious to hear about what you're seeing and what works.
We have a lot of companies that are working with high net worth family offices or foundations to get the pilot done. Because, for example, wildfire suppression, we have a company that is using autonomous helicopters to get to fires before they spread when they're as big as this room, as opposed to thousands of acres, and thereby reduce the tragedy, which Maui unfortunately knows so well, of rampant wildfire and the carbon that is generated. If wildfires were a country, they would rank number 4 in terms of carbon generated. And so all that work we've done for decades is wasted every time there's a huge wildfire season. So what happens is people don't know how to fund that. We stepped in, we said, this has got to change. We don't like all of our work being undone by a wildfire season at a very selfish level. But there are so many reasons why we need to get control over managing good fire, but not allowing bad fire to spread. And so we turn to, for example, a foundation that's very active where I used to work at Intel, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which has led in philanthropy for wildfire and reforestation and all things related to forests and water. And they are, and actually our speaker later from Tom Steyer is helping us with a pilot to to show people that this can actually be done, and that it's not 30 years from now. It's like 30 days from now, because no one else would fund that. I mean, we're funding some of it, but you can't use equity dollars to do a pilot like that. And so stitching together other high net worth offices and foundations that are committed to a vertical that you're going after, it's proving to be very effective. And I think you see that across the board.
Yeah, I would say that there's a couple really good examples here. One other example I'll give is a company we invested in called Forum Mobility, and they're a company that decarbonizes port infrastructure. So, like, for example, the Port of Long Beach, where we just announced a project a couple of weeks ago, and some of our team was there. There's like 20,000 trucks a day going in and out of the Port of Long Beach, right? And 39 million people live around ports. And talk about particulate pollution, Nancy was talking about before. These are sort of like ground zero for asthma, particulate air pollution, all kinds of health problems. And there's a mandate in California to transition all of the trucks, it's called drayage trucks, all the drayage trucks to electric, but there's not a way to finance the charging infrastructure nor the actual truck conversions to get there. Most of those truck businesses are not big companies like Maersk or something. It's actually little mom and pop companies that may have one or two trucks, and they need a financing solution to get there. Forum Mobility works on each piece of that. And they recently raised about $400 million of project finance to sort of help finance this transition. Elemental started with catalytic capital to de-risk the early projects, the pilots, to do the sort of the studies, the development work to get to that place. And then even within that structure, Homecoming Capital is one of the investors, which is from a high net worth individual. So in many ways, like, that was catalytic, even though it's, much larger source of capital. But oftentimes I think there are like families, foundations, family offices that are coming in creative ways to buy down some of the risk and bring in other investors. So that's one example. I do think the real challenge is that even though there are lots of like family offices and foundations and others that will fund in that space, it is extremely inefficient. So going to venture capital is a really efficient market. You know exactly what the VC wants. When you're going to anything outside of venture capital, you go to one person and they want one thing. The next person wants a different underwriting criteria. You go to 100 different people, family offices, they want 100 different things. So that is an inefficient way to sort of like finance the scale up and the pilots that VC has a very difficult time funding. And I think that's like still the core challenge that many of us are hacking away at.
Thank you, everyone. This has been amazing.